A Glance in the Mirror. Chapter 16. War-torn Britain. When war was declared, it was thought that bombs would start to rain down. The population, particularly the children, were disappointed. It was believed that the guns would start opening up and that dog fights would proliferate. It was not to be. Despite the country's guarantee to Poland, the government had no plans in place to conduct a war. And this was known as the Phoney War, and lasted for 9 months. It's just as well, for we were ill prepared, and 9 months would give us some chance to catch up and show our mettle. One of the more noticeable differences, and keenly felt, comparing the two societies then and now, is the lack of a few hard-working, socially minded individuals, both men and women, who gave their free time to the young. Just after World War II, youth clubs and associations flourished. It was unusual for a boy not to be enrolled in some official body, like the Scouts or the Boys' Brigade, Church Lads' Brigade, Youth Club, YMCA, or one of the 3 cadet corps. Girls, too, had their associations, but they tended to finish once they left school. These societies had their own creed, but mostly were attached to a church, linking the young to the country's religion, the ruling body, and the royal family. Number 31 Cumberland Road was designed in the late 20s and built in the 30s. The general strike of 1926 prompted the government to find solutions to reduce unemployment, and the result of this decision was to stimulate house building and develop new towns, and North Harrow was one of such towns. As you drive about Britain, you come across public buildings and houses that all have a somewhat similar architecture. The 1930s building style became recognisable by the use of brick and tile, gabled roofs, rough-cast walls, tile-hung bays and suspended floors, symmetrical windows with stained glass inserts and panelled doors. The front gardens were small and bordered by a privet hedge and divided by a narrow side entrance leading to a back garden. I have seen similar houses all around Britain, built to a particular standard of design and quality. There's nothing wrong with it. Once the trees and gardens had been planted, the formality was rather charming. This dormitory town, for that is what it was, having no factories or large offices, relied on the railways and buses to ferry the working population to the nearest main town and beyond, and London being only 20 minutes away. The town's wide pavements fronting the shops provided a feeling of light and space, whilst the classical-styled imitation marble-walled Embassy Cinema, one of the ABC chain, reserved for itself the role of premier landmark. In Britain, the years between 1935 and 1939 were considered the calm before the storm. Travellers, holiday-makers and businessmen who went to Europe came back with tales describing Germany as being prepared for expansion, both militarily and industrially, with a population indoctrinated to consider others, not Germanic, as inferior. The British government didn't discuss or predict their feelings of troubles to come, nor was it forcibly spoken of or written about by the media. At least, not sufficient to raise alarm or disturb the peace. North Harrow's political and social atmosphere was one of dignified calm, of people trying to get on with life. Most new building work had finished, for the land was totally developed, except the farmland at Headstone, still there today, that provides local dairy produce. Neither the leading citizens nor local government agencies gave any indication whatsoever what was imminent. Peace reigned in a vacuum. The summer of 1939 was glorious, predicting a good harvest. Cricket was being played at Lord's, where Middlesex harboured great expectations. No aircraft could be heard overhead, and London's airport was never mentioned. Northolt still had biplanes taking off and landing, and Brooklyn still held motor racing. Fathers walked with a furled umbrella or walking stick, wearing a jacket and tie. Mothers pushed coach-built prams with sunshades. Children wore school uniform, including a cap, and policemen patrolled on foot. Errand boys delivered goods on bikes, children skipped and collected cigarette cards, and football became the national sport, relegating cricket to second place. Lord Reith, the managing director of British Radio, demanded absolute decorum. Parks and recreation grounds, bowling greens and council gardens competed with each other to see who could cultivate the neatest lawns and plant the most colourful flower beds. In all of this, Harrow was absolutely no different from many other boroughs throughout Britain. Office workers, tradesmen, skilled workers and hospital staff were expected to work to a high standard, and most were proud of the quality of their work. Every trade skill was taught through an apprenticeship system, which had not long been reduced from 7 years to 5. Journeymen were justifiably proud when they had finished their training and stoutly defended any erosion in their place in the trade or wider society. Girls were not apprenticed. They were taught industrial schools, worked on building sites or drove cars. Mothers did not work full or part-time but stayed at home, at least until the youngest child went to junior school. Then they worked in shops, went back into nursing and teaching, and took on cleaning jobs. The town's citizens, although living in up-to-date houses, observed turn-of-the-century attitudes. Boy Scouts and Cubs, Girl Guides and Brownies were the centrepiece of many children's lives. Some older boys joined one or other of the Cadet Corps. Shops were shut on Sundays and Wednesday afternoons. Attendance at church was normal for about 50% of the population, attending at least one service during Sunday. Most young children went to Sunday school. Shops opened at 8 and closed at 5 during the weekdays. On Thursdays and Saturdays stayed open an hour later. There was no poverty. All the children were well dressed, keeping aside special clothes for Sundays. There was no rowdiness or drunken brawls. Tea shops were popular, and cakes and sandwiches formed the basis of afternoon tea. There were no hire purchase, and personal saving the only way to pay the bills. Jumble sales a regular feature, and tea dances a popular afternoon event. Much was made of the British Empire. The newsreel camera showed the royal family maintaining a rigid schedule of familiar appointments. The national anthem was played at every performance at the cinema, theatre and concert, and at most public meetings. Everybody stood, and those in uniform saluted. The national flag was hoisted on every big occasion, and each of the armed services was seen as saviours and protector of every country of the empire. Explorers, generals, colonialists and missionaries were written about and applauded. Newspapers, books and magazines promoted the empire's people, produce and position. Churches collected for the empire's poor and prayed for the continuance of the monarchy, the colonial system and the government. The country's laws, institutions, businesses and educational system were organised to continue its growth and wealth. The empire was a very important part of the country's way of life, and you were always made aware of it by all forms of indoctrination. This was not by official propaganda, but part of a proud culture. Just up from Station Road, almost on the corner of the crossroads, was the cinema, the Associated British Cinema, ABC, and they were owned by North Harrow's classically styled Embassy Cinema, which opened in October 1929. The frontage, decorated with linked railings, bordered oblong gardens, decorating the notice boards giving the current and future film previews. The large wooden double doors at the side of the cinema led to the deserted car park marked out at the back. Beyond, the town's woodyard was opposite the British restaurant. The pictures, or flicks, were the main form of public entertainment, from the earliest silent black and white films to CinemaScope and Technicolor. Up to the age of television, it performed its role for 50 years. The sound, delivered from a single central source behind the square screen, had to wait until after the war to be improved, and it wasn't a patch on Technicolor and stereophonic sound of later times. The majority of cinema audiences participated at least once a week, watching films from Hollywood. A life very different made the entertainment romantic and exciting. Every night, queues formed up outside the cinema, behind price boards. The queues stretched right round the cinema. Patrons slowly shuffled in during, but mainly after, each 3-hour performance. If there were no seats left, then there was standing room only, which you might have to put up with for the whole length of the film. A thick, grey, smoky haze greeted the ticket holder as the usherette's torch sent a beam of projected light into the black interior, penetrating the fog, lighting up the rows of seats. The rustle of sweet papers and the rasp of matches punctuated the film's performance. Courting couples filled the back row, with those standing unable to have seats leaning over the rail. The main event, a film, was the public's draw, enticing the audience in. A newsreel followed the advertisements and trailers before the second feature, B film. Larger cinemas, particularly on a Saturday evening, would put on a talent contest, band or organ recital, with the audience singing along, following the words shown on the screen. The nearest large cinema was the Granada, Harrow town, which also accommodated the Herger Cinema and a rather grand Coliseum theatre. It was an enormous treat to sit in its plush, red seats, particularly in the circle, and see the occasional West End show. The Langham, in Bridge Street, Pinner, was part of a small chain called the Modern Cinema Company, opened in 1936. The Grosvenor at Rayners Lane became part of the Odeon chain, which opened the same year. New house building started where the old Edwardian style left off, at Edgware Road and Willesden. All along the line, in the late 1920s, on either side of the railway, housing sprang up. Wembley Park, Preston Road, Northwick Park, on to North Harrow, Pinner and beyond. All this took place in the 20s and 30s. Previously it had been farmland, now transformed into the greater London sprawl. It linked up all the little villages and hamlets along the line. It just needed more schools and other institutions to convert each area into a new town status. And by the time the plan was completed, between 1928 and 1933, the European situation directed the government to reallocate the country's resources. Serious house building had to wait 25 years until it started up again in Chesham. By 1960, there was another enormous shortage of first-time buyers' homes. North Harrow was a place that grew out of the early 30s and prospered, linking the old towns of Harrow, Pinner and Wealdstone. Its design showed off town planning at its very best, with accommodation for all pockets and services to match. Many of the roads had pavements fringed by a grass verge. A crabapple or almond tree was planted outside each house, giving a pink haze in the tree's canopy in spring. The whole described poetically by John Betjeman as Metroland, a term applauding suburban planning. Householders competed with each other to see who could produce the best verge and the neatest front garden. By 1939 the gardens in the road were fully stocked with shrubs and trees, softening the outlook, which left with everyone with a lasting memory of flowering greenery. The scene presented to the interested onlooker was one of orderliness, neatness and tranquillity, essential requirements for lower middle-class life. Because newly built, the pavements, roads and buildings were clean and undamaged, in pristine order, no cracking paving slabs, discarded litter or graffiti. The town was exactly as designed, with no extensions, garages, conservatories, replacement windows or doors. Its citizens assumed the conventions of the studied politeness. Hats were raised to friends and neighbours, and audiences stood up for the national anthem. Germanic military expansion was threatening, sufficient to galvanize the government into building up the depleted armed forces and placing orders for military equipment. And even after this awakening, Britain was still poorly defended, its military woefully inadequate and badly trained. Tactics and procedure based on lessons learned during the first part of the First World War. The Indian Army and overseas detachments were in being to show force, military strength, to help the civilian authorities hold the peace. Many officers of the Indian Army were more interested in owning a polo pony, gymkhana, pig-sticking and tiger hunting. The military establishment was rigidly structured based on the class system, not on merit. The country's military force had to adapt to the new professionalism demonstrated by the German army when they occupied the Rhineland in March 1936. 2 years later, Hitler's soldiers marched into Austria. Albert and Elsie, with their 2 sons, Stanley and Terence, were established now in North Harrow. It was their 3rd year of marriage. Albert spent almost as much time at the drill hall and headquarters as he did at home. As a keen member of the Old Contemptibles and Battalion Masonic Lodge, he had a very full social life. The increased tension afforded by the Germans on the international scene reflected on the amount of time Albert spent at his papers. Now that he was happily married with a family, his home life was secure, and he could devote all his energies to his interests. North Harrow had proved to be an ideal spot to raise a family. The shops were closed, so too the schools and the railway, which linked him to Marylebone Station and the freight section where he had his office. The London and North Eastern Railway was needed by the government to shift freight from the north coast to London. Rearmament was galvanized a nation. Unemployment was now a thing of the past. It was fortunate that his complimentary ticket gave him free travel. Every morning Albert walked to the station to take the train over the railway bridge of riveted steel that spanned Station Road, casting a shadow on Headstone Hotel, the local hostelry. The railway station had 2 entrances, each with a bank of telephone kiosks. The ticket office displayed the tickets in serried ranks, drawn upon the counter ready to be punched. Access to the platform was made through the barrier, up the stairs, onto the raised platform, next to the waiting room. Bright advertising posters, hand-drawn and printed by the lithographic process, heralded Brighton and Seaton as being everyone's dream location for a holiday. The London Underground map, flanked by up and down timetables, hung frame on the platform and waiting room walls. At the crossroads stood the town's banks. Their railings and porticos, faced in Portland stone, gave a safe and dependable impression to visitors and townsfolk alike. Westminster, National and Commercial Bank stand guardians to the town's morality and permanence. Their managers pillars of society, citizens to be noted and respected. You need to be very sure of your own account before inquiring if any concessions were sought. Cheques were honoured at all times for those lucky to have an account. Normal folk dealt only with cash, saved religiously for each bill and paid when due. There was no hire purchase or loan club. You lived within your means. Many of the shops had countrywide names: Express Dairy, United Dairies, Dewhurst the Butchers, Home and Colonial, Maynard's the Sweet Shops, Cullum's, McFishery's, Boots the Chemist, Garner's and List's, the bread shops, W.H. Smith's, Woolworths, Cooper's the Ironmongers, and the Watford Co-op. The local dance studio operated from the large room over the cooperative department store. The tea dances taught ballroom, Latin American and old-time dancing. Previously this large room had been a snooker hall, and in common with many became obsolete. giving way to more profitable pastimes, both having long since disappeared along with the cinema, car showroom and bicycle repair shop. Another building which made North Harrow unusual was the car showroom, laid out underneath the distinctive clock tower. The large plate glass sliding doors separated off the public from the lucky few who could buy the latest models. Cars, what few there were serviced at the rear, next to the petrol pumps, their fuel pipes attached to swinging arms that carried the contents to the roadside. In 1939 there were nearly 2 million cars on the road, one for every 25 members of the population. The cheapest model could be bought for just over £100.